It's a busy season. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for what I know will be an enjoyable conversation with Richard Norton Smith. Before we get started, I just want to say a personal word of remembrance about a great, great friend and the unofficial mayor of Capitol Hill, Steve Simrod, whom we lost so tragically this week. You know, I don't think anybody, of course, always with Nicky by his side, but I don't think anybody has done more to improve the life of all of us on Capitol Hill than Steve Simrod. If you just think about, he's a real visionary, a real leader. I mean, I remember the Eastern Market fire. You know, one stepped up right away. We got to rebuild it and got the T-shirts out. You know, with Steve, what he's done for the public schools on the Hill, the literary feast, and this latest project that he has with the Library of Congress. And it's really true to say that this great Hill Center would not be here today without Steve Simrod. It's just as simple as that and as great as that. So I don't think he missed any one of our Talk of the Hill sessions. So we certainly miss him tonight, and we'll miss him for a long time here on forever on Capitol Hill. And he and Nicky, just forces of nature, lost so tragically. And then the second thing I want to say to open up is that if you like political biography, which I do, if you believe that government can still be a force for good and a force for improving people's lives, if you believe that one politician can really make a difference and get things done by sheer determination, then this is your book. All 721 pages of it. And I got to tell you, I loved and lived through every single page. It's a wonderful read. This is your book, and Nelson Rockefeller is your man. I have to tell you, incredible story.
Does it surprise you to say that? I mean, is there a time in your life when you would have...
No, I always admired him, but had no idea what he had accomplished. And Richard, I have to say, you've done an incredible public service by bringing us this story and this book. Richard is one of our nation's leading presidential historians. For a while, he was the official historian of C-SPAN.
That and a buck and a half will get you a cup of coffee.
Well, what's interesting about that is the very first speaker to our Talk of the Hill series on here at the Hill Center was Brian Lamb. Yeah. So anyhow, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you.
I just have to ask you, first of all, how long were you working on this book?
14 years, but who's counting? But in fact, that even underestimates it, because I'll tell you, when I was, well, the book opens with that extraordinary scene, post-midnight in the East, on July 14th, 1964. The New York Times called it Bastille Day in reverse, at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, when the Republican Party reinvented itself. I mean, it is rare to find moments in history that are so pregnant with historical significance. It was a confrontation between Nelson Rockefeller, who was the face of liberal republicanism, the Eastern establishment, everything that Barry Goldwater's supporters hated with a passion. In a larger sense, though, to me, it's a battle between fundamentalism of the political variety. The Rockefellers had been battling fundamentalism in the arts and in religion, you name it. So Nelson stood up there post-midnight, which was as late as the convention managers could push it back, trying to shrink the television audience. This is the first real television convention. And nobody knew, but they suspected that it wasn't going to be good. But no one had any idea, including Rockefeller, what his appearance would set off. And you had thousands of people who were basically cheering for Goldwater, which was fine, and denouncing Rockefeller. Remember, a lot of the opposition to Rockefeller was based not just on ideology or geography, but, quote, morality. Today, Nelson Rockefeller's divorce and remarriage would not create the waves that it did in 1963-64. My favorite scene is while Nelson is up there denouncing political extremism, which he defines as the American Communist Party, the Ku Klux Klan, and the John Birch Society. Now, the fact that there are several hundred Birchers on the floor, probably a majority of the California delegation, did nothing to endear him. But my favorite, so they were not happy, but beyond that, there was the divorce and remarriage. And there's a woman standing on top of a chair next to a North Dakota delegation, shouting at the top of her lungs, "You lousy lover, you lousy lover." Which gives you an idea of the tenor of the 1964 Republican National Convention. And to many people, it was his finest hour. Now, the other side of the coin is, he in some ways brought this about himself by his own conduct, by his own recklessness, some would say, by his convictions. He was a different kind of Republican, even then. For example, civil rights. Civil rights really mattered. Yeah. He was very close to Dr. King. When Dr. King was stabbed in Harlem in 1958 on a book tour, let that be a lesson, his hospital bills were all paid for by Nelson Rockefeller in private. More important, when the civil rights movement reached its zenith, arguably in Birmingham in the spring of 1963, and they were out of money. They were out of, first of all, they'd run out of adults who could be arrested, and so they went to children. Remember the Children's Crusade? And but the more important thing was they were running out of bail money to bail these kids out of school, or out of jail, so they could join the march the next day. Dr. King's personal lawyer was summoned to the vault of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Doesn't get more establishment than that, and handed a briefcase full of money. And when he got back to Birmingham, the loan had been forgiven, but it was $100,000, which provided. And then, of course, tragically, when Dr. King died, Nelson was on the phone within a half hour to Mrs. King saying, "What can we do?" His people organized and paid for the funeral. They found the mule-drawn wagon. They took Dr. King's children to see their father lying in state. And it was all, again, kept off the record because he didn't want to take advantage of the family's suffering.
When you look at the arc of his life, starting in his 20s, I guess, working for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he worked for every president up through Gerald Ford, and he achieved so much in the White House, as governor, in the arts world, in building stuff, which he loved to do. I mean, he achieved so much. What was the secret of his success? Was it just his drive and determination?
Well, part of it was actually something to do, I think, with his dyslexia, which went undiagnosed. He never heard the word dyslexia until he was 50 years old. As a boy at the Progressive Lincoln School, founded by his father, he concluded that he had a deficient IQ. And his mother, who is an extraordinary character, she's a pivot around which his story swings, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who created the Museum of Modern Art. He inherited her ebullience, her interest in other people, her compassion for other people, her curiosity about people who weren't named Rockefeller, how they lived. All of that came from Abby. But Abby told him, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. And beyond that, he was told the way he could overcome this intellectual deficiency was through sheer concentration. And all his life, it's interesting. Someone said to him late in life, you could have been a gigolo or you could have been governor. And he said, oh, God. Now, there are those who think he had the benefits of both, but that's for later in the book. But But he was an incredible workaholic. He also inherited his father's work ethic. Someone I talked to who joined the staff in the mid-'60s, he ran New York from 2 townhouses on 55th Street, which connected with 2 townhouses on 54th Street. But anyway, this friend noticed, he just started, and he noticed the big black Chrysler limousine, New York 1 license plate, parked outside of 20 West 55th. And in the back seat was the governor of New York, working away on papers. And this guy noticed this happened several times in the first couple weeks that he was there. And he asked him why. And he said, oh, well, it was my father who told me, never start the workday until you finish the day's previous work. And I mean,
so
he was, as a Rockefeller, he didn't have to do any of that.
Yeah.
He also was driven. I always think it's a mistake to think of him as a politician who collected art. He was a frustrated artist for whom politics and government afforded him an opportunity to indulge his creative side and his controlling side. So the vast project, you go to New York, Roosevelt Island, Battery Park City, Rockefeller Center, even the cloisters, which he apprenticed as a young man for his father.
MoMA.
All of the MoMA. He really designed the original MoMA building on 54th. All of those, and much more. You go to Albany, and imagine the governor of New York decreeing that we're going to knock down 99 acres of downtown, on which, by the way, 3,000 people, reliably Democratic voters, all happened to live. But he got away with it. His critics called it Brasilia on the Hudson. Which was actually not far off. I mean, Brasilia was one of the influences. He thought big, but ultimately it came down to something you won't hear from any Republicans, and you probably won't hear from many Democrats today. He said, "I feel if you don't have good health or a good education, then society has let you down." Now that's a sweeping view of not only what government, in a sense, is obliged to do, but the idea that there is such a thing as society with a sense of mutual obligation, moral obligation, if you will. That's why he built SUNY, the State University of New York, which was a handful of mediocre teacher schools, local schools, only one of which granted a liberal arts degree when he became governor. And when he was done, it is the world's largest university system, because he thought in the 20th century, higher education should be seen as, at the very least, a necessity, if not a right.
Last night at our White House Correspondents Association Christmas party, I was talking to some reporters who have been around for a while and knew Rockefeller and worked with him. You know some of them, of course. And they were saying that one of the things that always struck them, and it comes out in the book too, here's one of the wealthiest men ever to run for president or ever to be involved in American politics, and yet he was considered an ordinary guy. Sort of, he came across that way, right?
The 20s
or whatever
yeah.
his.
Well, and of course, Highfellow masked the fact that he couldn't remember names. But the funny thing is, he called people on his staff fella. I mean, I talked to people who worked for him for 20 years. He said, "Oh yeah, he'd say hiya fella to me," you know.
People saw him as kind of one of them. I mean, and I also remember he said the phrase, he wouldn't say thanks a million because that would give him away as a Rockefeller. He'd say thanks 1,000.
Yeah, which is a horrible. Stop and think. That came out of the '58 campaign when he was running against Averell Harriman. And in fact, Averell Harriman, one of his supporters in New York
had more money.
Yeah, the wonderful line. One of the joys of this book, sadly no longer available to readers, was to just immerse yourself in the daily journalism of a New York City that had 7 or 8 daily newspapers and wonderful, colorful, pungent viewpoints. Anyway, one of Harriman's supporters of the New York Post suggested a slogan for Governor Harriman running against Rockefeller, which was, "Don't swap multimillionaires in the middle of the street." They don't like that anymore. And Harriman was, he was a great diplomat, but he was a dreadful vote seeker.
In the preface to the book, you call Rockefeller probably the best retail politician that we've ever seen. If he was so good, what is it, 4 times he ran for president. He never made the big prize.
Because it's not about retail politics. Nelson Rockefeller never understood the difference. Well, he never accepted the difference between a November campaign and a convention campaign. That is to say, in New York, first of all, particularly this time, New York is the cradle of the New Deal. New York has a whole lot more, and now, had a whole lot more registered Democrats. And they were Roosevelt Democrats. They were Franklin Roosevelt Democrats, and now they were Eleanor Roosevelt and Herbert Lehman, Democrats. For a Republican to win, Tom Dewey had managed the trick several times. For a Republican to win in that constituency in the late 50s and 60s, in some ways almost disqualified him. The more successful you were in playing to urban polyglot New York, that wasn't going to get you delegates in Nebraska and Wyoming, in the way the Republican Party was mutating to the right at the end of the Eisenhower years. So you had that. He never understood. He always ran a November campaign. In '64, for example, I remember finding this one document. I copied, by the way, 60,000 pages of primary source material and did 150 interviews, which is one reason it took 14 years. But I found this document which said volumes. And it was literally, it was an internal House memo, joyously proclaiming the news that a poll of African-American voters in the District of Columbia showed Nelson Rockefeller getting 40% of the vote against Lyndon Johnson. To which one has to reply, so what? That wasn't going to get you a delegate. In fact, it probably was going to get you fewer delegates to the Republican convention. In 1968, when Bobby Kennedy was killed, there was a huge vacuum. And Nelson Rockefeller moved with considerable skill to fill it. And all kinds of, Daddy King, who's very close to the family, came on board, and General Gavin, and a whole lot of Kennedy supporters. But more than that, out on the streets of America, Rockefeller, you could feel blacks and Hispanics, and Bobby's constituency were looking for someone, and Nelson tapped into that. But the problem was, that wasn't going to get you nominated by the Republican Party in Miami in 1968. It's no surprise, well, it's now known because of the book, but Lyndon Johnson's candidate in 1968 was Nelson Rockefeller. After Nelson said in March that he wouldn't run.
Over Hubert?
Yeah. He was smuggled into the White House one night in April. I talked to the man who smuggled him in, along with Happy. And Rockefeller said to LBJ, they were a mutual piece of work. They were rivals in who could do more for people through government. But the last weekend of the Johnson presidency, who did they spend it with at Camp David but the Rockefellers? That was a very close relationship. Anyway, so here's the irony.
Well, wait, he smuggles him in.
And
tells him what.
And he tells him basically, Nelson says, I'm not the one you have to persuade, she is. So LBJ takes Happy away for a half hour, the Johnson treatment. I talked to Mrs. Rockefeller for this book, and she described LBJ as a magnificent animal. And one rather suspects she's an authority. But in any event, the next day, Rockefeller circulates word internally, we're going to go, But here's the irony. So he loses the nomination. Who knows if he had gotten in March, because Richard Nixon, they came within 25 votes of stopping Richard Nixon on the first ballot. And quite frankly, had Nixon been stopped on the first ballot, It's entirely likely you then would have had this clash of the titans with Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan, going at each other, and who knows what would have happened. But anyway, after the Republican convention, before the Democratic debacle in Chicago, Nelson gets a call and another call and then a call from the candidate himself. Herbert Humphrey wants him to run for vice president on a national unity ticket. And if you can remember, in 1968, unity was something we were decidedly lacking. And he couldn't bring himself to leave the party of his father, or particularly for that office, he always said, I'm not standby equipment. So he'd been offered the vice presidency by Nixon in 60. He was offered the vice presidency by Herbert Humphrey in 68. 2 weeks after Gerald Ford dumped him in 75, he gets a call from Humphrey and George Meany, who want to know, if we have a stalemate next June in New York, would you consider switching parties and being the Democratic nominee? Now whether they could deliver or not was another thing. But, it just goes to show how fluid, in some ways, American politics were.
With all the positive things he did, and such he was a progressive. He called himself a progressive. Yeah. There were some black marks on his character, too. One thing I was struck by, on drugs, he was a real hardliner on drugs. He was
also, but it's not ideological. First of all, he was tough on law and order. But people forget the drug program. Everyone knows about the Rockefeller drug laws. I think the New York Times has a key. They just press it. It says Rockefeller drug laws, and it hasn't changed in 40 years. The fact is, that was his third drug program. The first two were much more therapeutic. The third was clearly punitive.
Mandatory.
Oh yeah. Well, in fact, the most extreme example was the housewife who slipped her neighbor over the back fence diet pills could go to jail for 15 years. That was modified slightly, but there's no doubt. But here's the thing. Nelson Rockefeller, for better or worse, believed to the end of his days that there is no such thing as a problem that could not be solved. Mm. That was his great strength, and sometimes that was his undoing. He said to a friend before the third drug program, he said, I've wasted $1 billion fighting drugs to almost no effect. And he could not accept failure. And so I remember talking to his brother Lawrence before he died, who said, if Nelson had a fifth term in Albany, there would have been a fourth drug program once he realized that the third drug program wasn't working.
The other thing that struck me was that he wanted to make bomb shelters mandatory. Everybody had to build a bomb shelter under their house. I mean, talk about impractical for a guy like this to come up with that idea.
I call him a serial alarmist. and I mean, his whole career, in the 30s, working for FDR, he was warning us in tones of urgency about the threat that the Nazis presented in South America. In the 40s and the 50s, it was the communist menace. He was the coldest of cold warriors, but in the 60s, it was we had to deal with civil rights. So there is a tendency in this town more than most places, and in this time more than most eras, to put a label on people, to fit people in a pigeonhole. And part of the frustrating thing I think some reviewers have had with this is that he doesn't. He said, I have a Republican head and a Democratic heart, which in a nutshell explains why he never became president. But this was a Cold Warrior who believed in foreign aid as much as he believed in fallout shelters. He didn't see any contradiction between the two. But you're right, as governor of New York, the amazing thing is he got the legislature to pass it. He got the legislature to pass a program which was basically revised to make it one of tax incentives. Because the original estimate was it would cost $400 per New Yorker for everyone to have a fallout shelter. Now, he actually believed that this was civil defense, that if you had a strong enough shield, if you will, to protect against nuclear war, then you might help to deter nuclear war. Again, it seems crazy to us today, but at the time, I found a poll, 65% of the American people in 1957 expected a nuclear exchange within 24 months.
Yeah.
So again,
Yeah.
you've got to put yourself in a very different mindset.
The book is so rich with stories, and we're bouncing around, I know, but these things pop into my head. There's on so many occasions you have him campaigning, and suddenly art was his really number one passion. He would just stop and jump out of the car and go in and buy some art.
Yeah.
Like when he was depressed, he bought art.
Yeah.
I mean, and
Yeah, no, art was his great passion. I mean, he collected art the way most candidates collect delegates. I mean, he was much more, people, in those days, you know, the 64 campaign was resurrected in Oregon. You may remember. He lost to Henry Cabot Lodge in New Hampshire, and he wouldn't give up. He went out to Oregon. That was, you know, do or die, and he came from behind. He won. But in those days, you know, there was no direct flight. I mean, he had a private plane, but they still had to stop in somewhere in Nebraska to refuel. Okay, he would come home every weekend because Happy was pregnant. And of course, famously, she had a baby the weekend before the California primary. There are many people who believe that's what cost him the primary to Goldwater. And I discovered, to my astonishment, that in all likelihood the baby was induced by campaign strategists in New York who thought that it would actually buttress his reputation to be seen as a family man. I mean, this is over and over and over again. If he had listened to himself, if he followed his own gut instincts, instead of all these high-paid consultants, he was a victim of his own resources in some ways. And in some ways, I think the dyslexia and that advice from his mother worked to his disadvantage. But art was his great love. There's no doubt about it. There's a wonderful story that's not in the book, believe it or not. There's a story that's not in the book that takes place here in Washington. He somewhat resignedly told President Ford when he offered him the job that he would be willing to live at the vice president's residence. Well, he never did. He had 30 acres on Foxhall Road. Not bad, you know? And a 26-room colonial farmhouse that he had expanded. One night, Lawrence said it was like 3 in the morning, and he heard noises from downstairs. And he went down. There was his brother, the Vice President of the United States, with a flashlight, wandering around, lost, and saying, "I could swear I had a Picasso here." And he couldn't remember where that Picasso was. Well, it was up in New York. But his recreation on the weekend was stuffing his pocket with nails and taking a hammer and rearranging his art. Well, when he died, he owned 16,000 pieces of art. So that would be quite a job. But art was, yeah.
What happened in Attica, and talk about his
Attica, you know, it's funny
lowest moment, perhaps.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's the thing for which he's probably most unforgiven. And I understand it. It was the hardest chapter in the book for me to write because, on a number of levels. First of all, I wanted to do something that I don't think has been done in most Attica coverage, which is to actually incorporate multiple perspectives. The Rockefeller perspective has never been incorporated, in part because he wouldn't talk. And it's interesting, you know, when you start a book like this, you play all kinds of head games, and you think to yourself, all right, what is it that people are not going to want to talk about? Because there's always something. And the assumption is women. Not so. It was Attica. The people closest to Rockefeller are themselves scratching their heads over why this man, who was so assertive, who was so insistent that every problem could be solved, who was so inclined to put himself in the middle of whatever was going on, why he wouldn't go. And I think what's happened, first of all, over the years, is that people conflated two things. They conflated his decision not to go, which is debatable. I mean, I think it was a mistake, but it's at least debatable. You can understand why it was a point of principle he thought not to go. People conflate that with the terribly botched retaking of the prison, which no one can defend, and which you could argue, plausibly, had he gone, might have prevented, some of the excesses that we were. And then, of course, making it worse.
Didn't he give the order to retake the prison?
He did. He was, first of all, you have to remember, when this happened, he wasn't in New York. He was in Washington. And 36 hours went by before he went back to the city. And by that time, arguably the fatal mistake, he had, ironically, a progressive corrections commissioner, Russell Oswald, who was convinced that he could negotiate a peaceful solution. And so they had actually retaken half of the prison, but they called a halt. And Rockefeller went to his grave believing that was the mistake, that if they had kept on, even had there been casualties in the initial retaking, that one reason why this chapter was so difficult to write, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because I'm not in the least dismissive of the very legitimate outrage that people felt, for example, about conditions in Attica. I think one of the things that happened was, for lots of people, this was their introduction to how terrible conditions were in a state prison, which, believe it or not, was not worse than most. And the fact that it was the norm, in some ways, makes it all the more shocking. The overcrowding, the blatant racism, I mean, the conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think people have also conflated that. They've taken the conditions in Attica, which are indefensible, his refusal to go, which is imputed to either political, something to please the right wing, or callousness. Either way, it's indefensible. And then, of course, the actual retaking. And then, arguably the worst chapter of all, he made things much worse by rushing out before he had all the facts, describing, attributing causes of death, for example, which were easily disproved. I mean,
and quickly disproved, yeah.
Quickly disproved. Right. What I know, and again, he didn't serve himself well. He was of a generation of men who, didn't complain. If you were sick, you didn't, complain. I mean, the fact of the matter is, he was much more sensitive than the public. A day after the retaking of the prison, someone close to him complimented him on his tie, and Rockefeller said, "Red, the hangman's color." And I think for the rest of his life, he lived with the consequences of his actions. Yeah. But let's not forget, when telling the whole story of Attica, about the observers who were anything but observers, the crazy televised negotiations that were going on. I mean, this is a Paddy Chayefsky script in many ways, and the irony is they had reached agreement, what became known as the 28 points. Rockefeller signed off on it, but then, tragically, coincidentally, a guard died who had been beaten up in the initial takeover, and then amnesty became the issue. It crowded everything else out, and we'll never know. But it's the failure of the observers, quote unquote, to close the deal that then suddenly shifted the attention to Governor Rockefeller, who, by the way, spent the weekend at his estate at Pocatico. Yeah. I think trying to keep some distance from what was going on.
Your question's next, and there's so many others I have, but I do have to ask you, as quickly as you could sum it up, what do we know about how Nelson Rockefeller died? because that's where everybody goes in the book. They go right to that chapter.
Yeah, and I have to say, no one, at least no one, has criticized me for not, telling warts and all. I mean, I talked to paramedics. I mean, I got to just about everyone, except, of course, the two women who declined to speak, which I think speaks for itself. Two ways of answering that. First of all,
two women, Megan Marshak
and Panchita Pierce, who, by the way, still lives in the building, in the apartment that Rockefeller secured for her.
And she's the one who called 911.
Yes, and that's the story. The way I tell the story, it's the cover-up. It begins with the 911 call. And the fact of the matter is that the Rockefeller people, in the form of Hugh Morrow, his communications director, lied. They lied for what you might say were human and even understandable. They thought they would spare the family embarrassment. And of course, exactly, this is the era of Watergate. This is the New York City media. This is Jimmy Breslin and Anna Quinlan. Do you really think they're going to, sweep it under the rug? I mean, come on, get real. So, so what happened, of course, was within 12 hours, the cover-up was unraveling. That's important. I'll get back to the death once. That's important for the following reason. There are two historically significant questions we need to have answered about that night. Could anything differently have been done that would have saved his life? And the answer, I am convinced, is no. I believe he died instantly. I also believe he died not at his townhouse, but down the street in Megan's apartment, and the body was moved. That's one of the things that I reveal in the book with, I think, pretty good sources. And they almost got away with it. Mm-hmm. If she had not gotten in the ambulance and gone to the hospital with Rockefeller, they would have gotten away with it. The other thing that's important historically, oh, by the way, what no one has known until now, the backdrop, and it's important, is Nelson Rockefeller was a dying man before that night. Again, he tried to cover it up from Happy. He had a very serious heart condition. I think it's entirely possible he would have died wherever he was that night. I talked to Mrs. Rockefeller, who recreated that evening in what must have been painful detail. But, they'd gone to the Buckley School where the boys were. He introduced Henry Kissinger as a fundraiser. Then they went back and had dinner. She is convinced that he did not want to die in front of the boys and her. That his mother had died after a weekend with the family. Wonderful weekend. Monday morning she woke up and massive heart attack, was gone. The book is called On His Own Terms for a number of reasons. I think he thought he could have life on his own terms, the presidency on his own terms, and I think he thought he could have death on his own terms. The important thing historically is that night, in my estimation, is the night the American press redefined what was public and what was private in the lives of its, quote, public figures. It did not begin with Gary Hart. Gary Hart suffered the consequences of something that had begun the night of January 26, 1979. In another era, the press would have kind of, gotten together and hushed it up. Because they lied to the Times in turn, I use very, very few confidential sources, but this is one. Someone very high at the Times, and it was confirmed to me by the person who we talked to, said, you don't lie to us. You've never lied to us. You may spin, but you've never lied flat out. As a result, we are subjecting the 911 call to sophisticated electronic analysis. Now, that would not have been done under normal circumstances. And when they did, it turned out a second transcript became available. It became very clear that, in fact, the call was made by two women simultaneously, and in all likelihood from outside the townhouse, probably from a payphone on that street. Not because they didn't want the call traced back to the Rockefeller townhouse, but because they didn't want the call traced back to their apartment building. So that, in a nutshell, provides, what you need to know. There's a lot more.
Let me just say, if the last half hour doesn't give you an appetite to read every page in this book, I don't know what would. And it's just every single page and every footnote, just delicious. Thank you, Richard.
But we're one more surprise.
Okay.
Because really, I was surprised by surprises. He hated John. John Lindsay and Nelson Rockefeller were put on the planet to piss each other off. And they succeeded admirably in that objective, with great significance for the people of New York. Nelson used to say if John Lindsay wasn't so tall and good-looking, he'd be pushing a mop somewhere. John Lindsay called Nelson's apartment on Fifth Avenue Bector's Garden, that gives you an idea of the warmth that existed between these two characters. In May 1971, there was a character in this book, a guy named Kenny Ryland, who was Nelson's osteopath, and for 40 years his sidekick and I think sometime procurer, if the truth be told. But he also included Richard Nixon among his patients. And so he is the go-between. Nobody knew this guy existed. He's the go-between during the Nixon administration between Nelson and the president. And he has a diary, thousands of pages. I have the diary. And in it, one day in May 1971, make a long story short, they're wondering, what are we going to do about Lindsay? And Nixon asks, tell me about New York's wiretap law. And he goes on in the same conversation to offer to Nelson anything he needs, the FBI, the Justice Department, money, you name it, and quite clearly that includes wiretap assistance in order to get John Lindsay. And the funny thing is, John Lindsay went to his grave convinced that investigation, which in fact did take shape, originated in the White House. And he was right, but he couldn't prove it until now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Not here to read the book. This was it. Thank you. A few questions before we... we've got the microphone here too. Right. Yeah, sure. We'll start over here.
Thanks very much. Who is today's Nelson Rockefeller, if there is one?
There isn't one.
Nobody
the center of political gravity has moved. I'll tell you something that may surprise you. In some ways, Barack Obama is probably...
in what sense?
In the sense that he believes in government in an era when that's an unfashionable belief. Indeed, his failure, to the extent that you regard him as having failed, and he's not alone in this, is I think his inability thus far to fashion a liberalism for the 21st century, one that remains committed to using government as an instrument to improve people's lives, but which founders, and it's not his fault, it founders on a popular disbelief in government's ability to improve people's lives. Stop and think, and it's on the left as well as the right. On the left, you look at government and you see, we were lied into Iraq and we didn't exactly shine in Katrina. On the right, it's an article of faith that government is, more of a problem than it is a solution. So that doesn't leave a whole lot in between. I mean, I think Obama is the most cerebral president since Woodrow Wilson. He's too rational for the process as it has developed. He is clearly contemptuous of the way that much news coverage, quote unquote, of the White House and the political process has evolved. All of which, makes him, he and Nelson would have a lot in common. On the other hand, it is a measure of how far the center of gravity has moved to the right that Nelson Rockefeller wanted to provide universal health insurance at the state level in 1967. Arguably, Rockefeller is to the left of Barack Obama today. except on law and order.
Do you think,
Well, get the microphone?
do you think Nelson could find a place in today's Republican Party?
Oh, God, no. Gerald Ford couldn't find a place in today's. No, and I say that as someone who knew him well, and that's my next book.
Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford. No, Nelson Rockefeller was a man without a party during his lifetime. I mean, the idea he himself, the Republican head and the Democratic heart, to succeed in New York is to be disqualified in Arizona, you know. The Republican Party, great story. 2 weeks before the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon, Barry Goldwater calls Thurston Morton, the Republican National Chairman, with some advice. He said Nixon shouldn't waste any time these last 2 weeks in New York or the urban East. What he means is don't waste time trying to get black votes. He should spend his time in Illinois and Texas. And then Goldwater, being Goldwater, he doesn't stop there. He says, you know, I'd like to win this goddamn election without New York. Then we could tell New York to kiss our ass, and we could start a really conservative party. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. The fact of the matter is, before Dwight Eisenhower left office, the Republican Party was mutating. If you think of the 1960, it's a long time ago, but at the 1960 convention, ostensibly, the story was this effort to draft Rockefeller. But if you talk to the delegates, you know, Barry Goldwater even then had the hearts of many who would reluctantly vote for Nixon. He was an acceptable conservative, just as he was an acceptable conservative in 1968. But their passion would be for Reagan in 68, and their antipathy, putting it mildly, would be for Rockefeller any year.
Yes, we can get the microphone. We use the microphone because we're taping the session. Richard said we want the questions on tape.
It's fascinating. I'm a native New Yorker. I've loved listening to you and your dialect as well. So I got two questions, if I could.
Yeah.
One is, what was his relationship with Robert Moses? And a second question is Willowbrook. And is he? Can you lay at his feet the you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Deinstitutionalization movement.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. First of all, he is the only governor who had the balls to fire Robert Moses. And he did it, Moses has been there forever. He had half a dozen jobs, including the upcoming New York World's Fair, which he managed to screw up. And Nelson decided it was time that his brother Lawrence, who was Mr. Conservation. Lyndon Johnson used to say, "Where's Lady Bird? Is she out planting flowers with Lawrence Rockefeller again?" And it was Lady Bird who called him Mr. Conservation. I mean, he had his own credentials in this field. And time is moving on. 1962, Nelson decides, hey, to Moses, it's time to give up one of your titles. You can keep the other five, because he's long past retirement age. Anyway, so, and of course Moses, being accustomed to threaten, and he usually could have the journalistic, posses come to his rescue. He was irreplaceable. He tried it, and it didn't work on Nelson. And he stormed out of the office on 55th Street. Later in the day, realizing what he had done, he sent an emissary back to try to retrieve the situation. And unfortunately, in the meantime, he had gone public with criticism of Lawrence. Well, that, you didn't attack the family.
Yeah.
Nelson and Lawrence Rockefeller were joined at the hip all their lives. When I went to see Lawrence, he was 91. 20 years had passed since Nelson's death. And we sat in Nelson's office in room 5600, unchanged since Nelson died, next to Lawrence's. He would sit in Nelson's office every day and have lunch and commune with his dead brother's spirit. Wow. So that's how close they were. And Moses learned that to his dismay. Now, that said, when the Empire State Plaza, the South Mall to people in Albany, was rededicated 3 months before he died, something happy arranged because she knew he was dying. Who did he bring with him to see his Rockefeller Center? He brought Robert Moses. You know? Your question about deinstitutionalization. Yeah, Willowbrook was in some ways akin to Attica in the sense that, you know, Geraldo Rivera, or Jerry Rivers, or whatever his name was in those days, avatar of the new journalism, which is, I guess, more about the journalist than the story. Anyway, he snuck a camera into Willowbrook, and of course, the pictures were horrifying. It was much like people who read about actual conditions in Attica. It was the first time they'd been exposed to just how bad things were. And Rockefeller, you know, did not respond well in the immediate sense, but there's no doubt the deinstitutionalization. He had actually already, ironically, begun a movement. He called them hostels. He wanted to downsize these huge Dickensian warehouses where people were sent to die, basically, in appalling conditions. And he wanted to modernize it. He wanted to diminish the overall population of the mentally retarded. And in some ways, it was an enlightened approach for which he got very little credit because of Willowbrook.
I just have to add a footnote here, and from one of your footnotes, because you used the phrase that he had the balls to fire Robert Moses. One of my favorite footnotes, and Rockefeller loved this. It was a note in the Lockport Journal one day that appeared, and I'll read it word for word. Governor and Mrs. Rockefeller came to Lockport accompanied by District Attorney and Mrs. John A. Ball of Buffalo. Following the cocktail party in the afternoon, the governor was taken back to Buffalo by the Balls.
Well,
I was actually in the paper, and he used to show it to people and say, "Oh, look at this."
And what you need to know was, that was subjected to the groupthink test. There were 15 people sitting around a table advising him on whether he could say that in the annual dinner, which was, by the way, stag, as you might imagine. And in the end, it was Malcolm Wilson, the very proper, very Catholic, theologically correct lieutenant governor, who said, "Yeah, you can say that."
So we just did. Anyhow,
Yeah.
that's why you have to read the footnotes.
If you go to Albany, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, which is right next door to the governor's mansion, it's the only thing that was saved. Malcolm went to Cardinal Spellman, and they managed to talk Governor Rockefeller out of tearing down the cathedral, the Immaculate Conception. But the other 99 acres, sorry, you know.
All right. One more question before we break? Okay, yes? Over here, no? Well, okay, go ahead.
It's an easy question, but I was just curious how you developed enough of an interest in Nelson Rockefeller to spend 14 years of your life writing.
Well, it goes back, I watched that scene at the age of 10. I was a very strange child. Some would say I was a preview of coming attractions. Annoyingly precocious, and I at the age of 10 was well aware of Nelson Rockefeller and who the good guys were. I grew up in Massachusetts, and who the good guys were and the bad guys, and I guess you could call me an aspirant to the Eastern establishment who joined the club, you know, when it was too late. But in any event, I watched that and never got over it, never forgot it. And then 4 years later, at the age of 14, I was in Miami Beach on the floor of the Republican convention carrying my Rockefeller sign. And I'd been doing my calculations, and I knew we weren't going to win because the Reagan people weren't holding up their end of the bargain. And I remember in sheer frustration, my contribution in 1968 to that year's political violence we were marching through the Iowa delegation, which was a bunch of stolid farmers for Nixon, one of whom I remember striking with my side. And it didn't get us any delegates, but it felt awfully good. So in that moment, I understood the students at the Sorbonne, who were rioting against General de Gaulle. And then where it really starts is one day in 1989, I was doing double duty as director of the Hoover and the Eisenhower libraries. I had been asked to take over the Eisenhower Centenary for the National Archives. And so I was in Abilene, meeting with everyone, and there was a guy named Jim Cannon, who of course was a great Newsweek correspondent, a great reporter, and worked for Rockefeller for several years. In fact, Jim Cannon is more responsible than anyone else for revenue sharing. And then later he worked for Howard Baker, and he went with Howard Baker to the Reagan White House at the end of the Reagan presidency. So he had a really remarkable career. But anyway, in 1989, it's a long way from Abilene to the Kansas City airport. As I said, I was in Kansas 2 weeks ago. As I said, the scenery was lovely, but there was an awful lot of it, And fortunately, we filled the entire trip with Jim Cannon's Rockefeller stories. And I think actually the book was born before we got to the Kansas City airport. I just started working on it in 2000. First person I interviewed was Bill Scranton, who sadly very recently passed away. And so it's I wouldn't call it a labor of love, because that suggests a kind of uncritical. I went through many sort of permutations. One reason it took 14 years is it takes a while to outgrow that youthful, uncritical, and obviously you can't approach a book like this, which to have any credibility at all has to be, quote, critical, detached, be willing to spill the beans repeatedly. But then you don't want to go to the other extreme either, So you're finding that Goldilocks spot took time. But I'm glad I had a publisher. They didn't give me money, but they gave me time. And time was what I needed.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book, and it's been a great, great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Richard Norton Smith.
Thank you.